Steve Harvey stopped the show, turned to the cameras, and said, "This needs to air." But what had just happened? The studio fell silent. Every producer in the control room froze. The audience, seconds earlier roaring with laughter, now sat motionless, some with hands over their mouths, others wiping away tears. Steve Harvey, the man who had commanded that stage for over a decade with quick wit and infectious energy, stood completely still. His hand was pressed against his chest, and his eyes were glistening under the bright studio lights. Something had shifted. Something profound. And it all started with 5 words from a woman standing at the contestant podium. "You saved my life, Steve." Those weren't the words of a casual fan. They weren't a scripted moment. They were raw, real, and they carried a weight that no one in that studio was prepared for. Not the crew. Not the producers. And certainly not Steve Harvey himself. But to understand why those 5 words stopped one of the most high-energy game shows on television, we have to go back. Back to where this story truly began. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The Family Feud studio in Los Angeles buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. Contestants were being prepped, audience members were finding their seats, and Steve Harvey was in his dressing room going over the day's questions. Just another taping day. Or so everyone thought. Among the contestants scheduled to appear that day was a woman named Rebecca Thompson. She was 42 years old, a mother of 2 from a small town in Ohio. Rebecca had applied to be on Family Feud months earlier, not because she was a superfan or because she thought she'd win big money, but because she needed something. She needed hope. 6 months before that taping day, Rebecca's world had collapsed. Her husband of 18 years, Michael, had died suddenly from a heart attack. No warning. No goodbye. One moment he was there, and the next, he wasn't. Rebecca was left alone with 2 teenage daughters, a mountain of debt, and a grief so heavy she could barely get out of bed each morning. The weeks after Michael's death were a blur. Rebecca went through the motions cooking meals she didn't taste, attending parent-teacher conferences where she couldn't focus, lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. Her daughters tried to help, but they were drowning in their own grief. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt like a tomb. Then came the moment that would change everything. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday night, 3 months after Michael's death. Rebecca sat alone in her living room, the television providing the only light in the house. She had been crying for hours, and a thought had crept into her mind, a dark thought she'd been fighting for weeks. What if I just gave up? What if I couldn't do this anymore? She reached for the remote, ready to turn off the TV and surrender to that darkness. But then, Family Feud came on. A rerun from years earlier. And there was Steve Harvey, doing what he did best, making people laugh, connecting with strangers, turning everyday people into momentary stars. Rebecca didn't know why she kept watching. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was fate. But as the episode played, something shifted inside her. Steve wasn't just hosting a game show. He was celebrating people. He was finding joy in small moments. He was reminding everyone watching that life, even in its simplest form, could still be beautiful. One of the contestants that night was a single mother who had mentioned she was struggling. Steve stopped the game, looked at her, and said something Rebecca would never forget. "You're stronger than you know. And tomorrow will be a little easier than today. You just gotta keep showing up." Those words weren't meant for Rebecca. Steve Harvey had no idea she existed. But in that moment, sitting alone in her dark living room at 2 a.m., those words became hers. They became a lifeline. She didn't turn off the TV. Instead, she watched 3 more episodes. And then 3 more. By the time the sun came up, Rebecca had made a decision. She would keep showing up. For her daughters. For herself. For the life Michael would have wanted her to live. Family Feud became her anchor. Every night, she would watch reruns. Steve's laughter, his wisdom, his ability to find humanity in every interaction, it gave her something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Months passed. Rebecca started therapy. She joined a grief support group. She found a part-time job. Slowly, painfully, she began to rebuild. And every night she would end her day the same way, watching Steve Harvey remind her that joy still existed in the world. When she saw the casting call for Family Feud, something told her to apply. Not because she thought she'd win. Not because she wanted to be on TV. But because she needed to say thank you. She needed Steve Harvey to know what he had done for her without even knowing she existed. The application process took weeks. Interviews, background checks, scheduling. And then, finally, the call came. Rebecca Thompson, you've been selected to compete on Family Feud. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The day of the taping arrived. Rebecca stood backstage with her family team, her 2 daughters, her sister, and her late husband's brother. They had all agreed to do this together, to honor Michael's memory in a place that had brought light back into their lives. As they waited for their turn, Rebecca clutched a small piece of paper in her hand. On it, she had written what she wanted to say to Steve if she got the chance. She had rehearsed it 100 times. But now, standing there, her heart pounding, she wasn't sure she could actually do it. Family number 2, you're up, a producer called. Rebecca's team walked onto that iconic stage. The lights were brighter than she'd imagined. The audience was louder. And then, there he was, Steve Harvey, walking toward them with that signature smile, microphone in hand. Welcome, welcome, Steve said, shaking hands with each family member. When he got to Rebecca, he paused. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, or maybe it was something in her eyes, but Steve held her hand a moment longer than the others. You all right? He asked quietly. Rebecca nodded, unable to speak. The game began. The first few rounds went as expected. Laughter, wrong answers, the usual Family Feud chaos. Steve was in his element, cracking jokes, teasing contestants, working the crowd. Rebecca's family was doing well, but she was somewhere else, her mind racing, that piece of paper still folded tightly in her palm. Then came the final round. Rebecca's team had won. Confetti was falling. The audience was cheering. Steve walked over to congratulate them, and that's when Rebecca knew it was now or never. Steve, she said, her voice barely audible over the noise. He turned to her, still smiling. Yeah? Can I say something? Rebecca asked. Steve gestured to the crowd to quiet down. Of course. What's on your mind? Rebecca took a breath. The studio fell silent. Every eye was on her. And then, with tears streaming down her face, she said it. You saved my life, Steve. And you didn't even know it. The words hung in the air like a confession, like a prayer. Steve Harvey froze. His smile faded. His hand, which had been gesturing casually, dropped to his side. For a man who made his living with words, Steve Harvey had none. What? He finally whispered. Rebecca's voice cracked as she continued. 6 months ago, my husband died. And I didn't think I could go on. I was ready to give up. But one night, I was watching your show, and you said something to a contestant. You told her, you're stronger than you know, and tomorrow will be a little easier than today. You have no idea, but those words saved me. The audience was completely silent. Some were crying. Others sat frozen, hands clasped in their laps. The cameras kept rolling, but even the crew members had stopped moving. Steve looked at Rebecca, really looked at her, and what happened next would become one of the most unforgettable moments in Family Feud history. He walked toward her. Not as a host. Not as a performer. But as a human being who had just been handed the weight of another person's survival. He reached Rebecca, and without a word, he pulled her into an embrace. The studio erupted. Not with cheers, but with a collective release of emotion. Audience members stood, many openly weeping. Rebecca's daughters collapsed into each other's arms. Even the producers in the control room, hardened by years of television production, wiped their eyes. Steve held Rebecca for what felt like an eternity. When he finally pulled back, his own face was wet with tears. He looked at her, then at the cameras, and said words that no one expected. Stop the show. This needs to air. I don't care what we have to cut. This needs to air. He turned back to Rebecca. What's your husband's name? Michael, she said softly. Steve nodded. He took off his suit jacket, the jacket he wore in every episode, the one that had become part of his signature look, and draped it over Rebecca's shoulders. You wear this, he said. And you remember that Michael's love didn't die with him. It's in you. It's in your daughters. And it brought you here today. Then Steve did something that broke every rule of television production. He turned to the audience and said, If anyone here has ever felt like giving up, stand up right now. Slowly, people began to rise. First a few, then dozens, then nearly everyone in the studio. The camera panned across the crowd, a teenage boy, an elderly woman, a young mother holding a baby, a man in a military uniform. All standing. All connected by the invisible thread of survival. Steve looked at them, then back at Rebecca. You see that? You're not alone. None of us are. Behind the scenes, something extraordinary was happening. The producers had made a decision that defied every expectation. Normally, a moment like this would be edited, tightened, made television ready. But as they watched the monitors in the control room, they knew this was different. This wasn't content. This was truth. And truth, in its rawest form, was exactly what the world needed to see. The episode aired 3 weeks later, exactly as it happened. No edits. No cuts. Just Steve Harvey, Rebecca Thompson, and a moment of pure humanity on a game show stage. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the clip had millions of views. News outlets picked it up. Mental health organizations shared it. But more importantly, people reached out. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of messages flooded in from people saying the same thing Rebecca had said. This saved my life. People who had been on the edge, who had been fighting their own darkness, watched Steve embrace Rebecca and realized they weren't alone. They saw a man who had spent his life making people laugh choose, in that moment, to make someone feel seen. And that choice rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. Steve Harvey didn't plan to become a beacon of hope that day. He didn't wake up thinking he'd save lives. He was just doing his job, hosting a game show, trying to bring joy to people's living rooms. But that's the thing about impact. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up, be kind, and speak words that someone, somewhere, desperately needs to hear. Months after the episode aired, Steve received a letter. It was from Rebecca's daughter, Emily. She wrote, Dear Steve, my mom gave me your jacket to keep safe. I hung it in my room, right next to a photo of my dad. Every morning when I wake up, I see them both, and I remember what you told her, that love doesn't die. Thank you for giving my mom back to us. Thank you for showing me that even when everything falls apart, there are still people who care. You saved more than one life that day. You saved our whole family. Steve never shared that letter publicly. He kept it in his dressing room, tucked inside a Bible his grandmother gave him decades ago. And every time he walked onto that Family Feud stage, he'd think about Rebecca, about Emily, about all the people watching who might need to hear something they didn't even know they were waiting for. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. A year after the episode aired, Family Feud invited Rebecca back. Not to compete again, but to do something else. Steve Harvey stood on that same stage, in front of a packed audience, and announced the creation of the Michael Thompson Memorial Fund, a scholarship for children who had lost a parent. The fund was launched with a donation from Steve himself, matched by the network, and supported by contributions from viewers who had been moved by Rebecca's story. Rebecca stood on that stage again, this time not as a contestant, but as a partner in something bigger than herself. And when Steve handed her the ceremonial check, he said, Michael's legacy isn't just in what he left behind. It's in what you chose to do with your pain. You turned your grief into hope. And now, other families won't have to walk this road alone. The audience stood and applauded for 5 full minutes. But the most powerful moment came when Steve pulled something from his pocket, the original piece of paper Rebecca had written her thank you note on, the one she'd clutched so tightly that day. He'd kept it. "I carry this everywhere," Steve said quietly, "because it reminds me that we never know who's watching. We never know whose life we might touch just by showing up and being human." Rebecca took the paper, folded it carefully, and placed it in her purse next to a photo of Michael. 2 pieces of paper. 2 lifelines. Both reminders that love, kindness, and hope never truly die. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Because somewhere, right now, someone needs to hear it. And you might just be the person who helps them find it.